Good morning, everyone. I'm Nez Aquino, Chief Operating Officer at the Global Risk Institute. On behalf of GRI, I am pleased to welcome everyone to the fifth and final event in our 2025 Macroeconomic Policy webinar series. In the first four webinars, we examined the monetary policy outlook, the housing market, fiscal policy, and we explored Canada's economic strategy amid the ongoing US policy reset. In case you missed these sessions, they're available on our website. Today's event is on reevaluating monetary policy in an age of uncertainty. The session will be moderated by Jason Stewart, Executive in Residence at GRI, and it features former Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada, Bill White. I'm joining this event from GRI's offices in Toronto, situated on the traditional territory of many First Nations covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and now home to many diverse nations, Inuit and Métis peoples. The ongoing uncertainties stemming from the current US administration has once again put into focus the very important role that central banks play in promoting stability in the face of rising geopolitical risk, rising trade instability, and persistent fiscal deficits here in Canada. We will examine today whether the existing frameworks on how we think about the economy at large are still relevant and helpful, and explore the lessons learned from past events in navigating the complexity of current times. Before I turn it over to Jason and Bill, a couple of notes. We are recording this session and it will be available on our website in a couple of days. At the end of the session, you'll have time to ask your questions. Please send it to the All Panelists channel. And finally, when you're exiting this webinar, please take a moment to fill in our survey, which will show us your input and feedback, and it will inform our future sessions. With that, Jason, over to you.
Thank you, Nez, and good morning. Today's webinar occurs against an extraordinary economic and geopolitical background and the unintended roller coaster of central bank policy rates and quantitative measures already this decade. These began in 2020 with the plunge in policy rates, massive quantitative easing, and forward guidance that was key to containing the pandemic's economic and financial contraction. But enormous stimulus then continued for too long, helping cause the surge in inflation and necessitating a pivot to rapid large rate hikes and quantitative tightening in 2022 and 2023. The subsequent disinflation enabled significant rate cuts to occur. Monetary policy normalization supported a rebound by late 2024 in Canadian job growth, consumer spending, and business confidence, and continued U.S. economic strength. But this improvement stalled in early 2025 with trade conflicts, huge policy uncertainty, and U.S.-generated seismic shifts in geopolitics. Given these extraordinary times, we are fortunate to have our speaker, Bill White, to provide his perspective on the opportunities, risks, and uncertainties for monetary policy in 2025 and beyond. Bill White is a senior fellow at the C.D. Howe Institute. His distinguished career includes senior roles at the Bank of Canada, the Bank for International Settlements, and the OECD. Bill's impressive record at previous GRI webinars includes, in early 2022, he highlighted the risk of much higher rate increases for longer than markets and policymakers expected, well before faster and larger policy rate hikes occurred. In early 2023, Bill cited overall financial system risks far in advance of the bank collapses such as Silicon Valley, Credit Suisse, and First Republic. And in early 2024, he stressed the risks of negative supply shocks, making the trade-offs among fighting inflation, financial stability, and growth more difficult for central banks this decade. Bill's leading-edge papers in the last 2 years alone include Why the Monetary Policy Framework in Advanced Countries Needs Fundamental Reform, The New Age of Scarcity in the 2020s, and Mitigating Global Warming is Not Our Only Problem. Are we sleepwalking towards a global polycrisis? I would now like to welcome Bill and ask him to please begin.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jason. That's a very fulsome introduction. I'm very pleased to be here. I thank you for the invitation. Speakers are always really pleased to be invited back. And since I've been invited back 5 times, I have to say that I'm very, very pleased to be here. My topic today is reevaluating monetary policy in an age of uncertainty, a new approach to contain inflation and support financial stability. Well, after the colon, it might otherwise have been put, embracing the implications of complexity. Today, I'm not going to get into the weeds of has monetary policy been eased too much or too little or just enough. Lots and lots of people are doing that. Rather, what I want to raise is the possibility that there's something wrong with the fundamental assumptions on which the inflation targeting framework is based. That we actually live in a world of complexity, as opposed to the kind of simple world that most central bank models seem to assume that we live in. So let me turn to the first of my slides. And can I just say here too that what I will be saying today here does not apply specifically to the Bank of Canada. What I'm really talking about is the assumptions underlying the inflation targeting framework used by all of the major central banks. So it isn't just isn't an issue raised here for Canada. It's an issue that I'm raising more generally. The inflation targeting framework, for all of its advantages, also has shortcomings. And you see this in some of the things that have come out of following this framework for the last 20, 25 years. The first point I guess I would make is that if you've got a positive inflation target, it ensures that price levels drift upwards. So if you've got a framework that basically says we can't tolerate prices going down, even though they ought to go down because of increases in productivity or other positive supply side shocks, the prices are never allowed to go down. They're only ever allowed to go up. Then you get this constant upward drift in the level of prices that people find really quite disquieting. The second point, again, looking back over the last 20, 30 years, successive bouts of monetary easing have become ineffective. So that if you look at successive cycles, what you see is that each cycle, the degree of monetary easing, the vigor with which the easing takes place, has become larger and larger. And the reason why that is so is because the way monetary policy works is it induces people to take out debts to receive the money that they can then use for spending. But over periods of time, that buildup of debt gets higher and higher and higher, especially if safety nets don't really allow the debt to be reduced. The third point, and I think this might even be a worse outcome, again, a longer run implication of the way in which policy is conducted, is that you eventually get debt levels, both public and private, that become so high that the system becomes incapable of dealing with higher for longer, or above that, incapable of dealing with even higher interest rates. And the difficulty then, I call it financial and fiscal dominance. Financial dominance is when private debts are so high, the central bank is afraid to raise interest rates higher because it will threaten the stability of the financial system. Fiscal dominance refers to the situation in which debt levels are already so high that if you were to raise interest rates higher, you would generate fears of increasing inflation, not decreasing inflation, as the government has to turn to the central bank to print more money to finance itself. So fiscal dominance. So we have a problem here. If the debt levels are high enough, you can't raise interest rates because of fear of setting off these problems. Another point, again, looking back over the last 20 or 30 years, inequality has increased. And in part, I think it's because when you when you lower interest rates, you raise asset prices, and the assets belong to rich people. And so the gap in terms of wealth becomes greater and greater. And at the same time, looking back over the last 20 or 30 years, what we do see is that in all the advanced market economies, potential growth has decreased. I think that's something to do with what Hayek called malinvestments, that when you have very easy monetary conditions, people invest their money in rather stupid ways, and potential growth suffers in consequence. So my conclusion from all of this is that the underlying analytical framework needs rethinking. The fundamental error is that all of the models have been set up, the analytical frameworks basically assume that the economy is a machine, that it's simple, it's understandable, and it's controllable. And the problem is that none of these things are true. In the course of simplification, so much stuff has to be stripped away. In most of the models that are being used, there's no financial system, basically. The supply side is very, very oversimplified. And then in addition, in order to make these models what they call tractable, you have to make a number of other sort of simplifications. All the functions are linear, that we know the probability distributions of all these functions, that nothing changes over time, that the economy has a natural tendency to refer to equilibrium, to go back to equilibrium at full employment and at the inflation target that the central bank has laid out. The problem is none of this stuff is true. What is true, I think, is that the economy is not a machine, it's a forest. And that is to say that it is a system made up of millions of interacting agents, all observing what others are doing and learning from them, changing their decision processes over time. And these kinds of systems have been well studied in many, many other disciplines. And these systems, referred to here as complex adaptive systems, have properties which are totally different from the properties that I've just described as underlying the current inflation targeting frameworks. These complex adaptive systems have nonlinear properties. That is to say that they have tipping points. Things can start to go wrong and go wrong very badly. They are models in which uncertainty prevails, not risk. And I forgot to underline that. Once you define a function as having well understood probability function, you're basically saying you know what the risks are. That's a very different thing from uncertainty, as Frank Knight and Keynes originally made that distinction. Uncertainty is a world in which you have no idea what the probability function is. And in these complex adaptive systems, like a forest, there's no equilibrium either. Okay, so you don't have this delightful property where the system itself goes back to doing things that you want it to do. So, put otherwise, in the framework that we have that underlies inflation targeting, really bad things can't happen. Whereas the assumption of complex adaptive systems, these are systems with nonlinear properties in which really bad things can happen. And once you make that distinction between sort of the properties of the system that we currently assume, as opposed to the properties that are held by complex adaptive systems, then you have to have not only different models, and we can talk about that later in the question time, but you need radically new approaches to policy. And I want to say a few words about that. Supposing that we do embrace the economy as a complex adaptive system, I think that there are simple policy lessons. It's ironic, but there are simple policy lessons to be learned from embracing the economy as a complex adaptive system. There are lessons to help prevent crises. There's lessons to help monitor signs of systemic stress. And there are lessons to help manage crises when they do occur. So let's talk about each of those things. Lessons to help prevent and minimize the cost of crises. Well, the first point to make in these complex adaptive systems is that these systems always break down, and they break down according to a power law. So big breakdowns happen very infrequently. More minor breakdowns occur more frequently. So, but the point is that there are these breakdowns. So you can't formulate your policy just on the basis of it being effective in the next quarter or the next couple of quarters. You really do have to be concerned about the longer run implications. So there's a trade-off between effectiveness and stability over time, or sustainability over time. Another point that I would make about these multiple properties is multiple agents. So that if you have a world in which there's not just one consumer or one producer, but there's millions of each, then you've got to be concerned about the distribution between the various agents, because the distributions between the various agents have very important consequences, not just for the effectiveness of policy, but they also have very important political implications. And that's something, of course, that I think recent developments indicate, the link between economic bad times and political disruption, something that I think we should be taking more consideration of. Second point about these complex adaptive systems, relevant to preventing and minimizing the cost of crises, is that policy can affect structure, and structure matters for outcomes. So in these kinds of systems, what you're trying, it's not a kind of top-down control, it's a bottom-up control of a dynamic system. And you can change the character of the system and the dynamics of the system by sometimes quite minor changes to structure. So that's a very important point. So our understanding, third point, minimize, not maximize. Our understanding of these complex adaptive systems is limited, okay? And it's not that we're stupid, it's just that the complexity of these systems means you cannot know as much about them as you would like to know. So the current practice of trying to maximize GDP and squeeze the last dollar of GDP out of the system, it's not really possible to do it because we don't know enough. So the lesson that you take away from that is that the objective of policy ought to be avoiding really bad outcomes. So you can't maximize. Rather, what you should be doing is something like mini-maxing, which is trying to avoid really bad outcomes. And of course, I guess what also goes along with that is that recognizing that absence of full knowledge, one really a policymaker ought to take the Hippocratic Oath, that you really should try to ensure that you do no harm. And what that means, I think, and we'll see this perhaps a little bit later talking about QE and forward guidance, etc., is that when you should introduce really experimental policies in a very careful and prudent way, because changing the structure of the system using those kind of policies can lead to highly unexpected and oftentimes quite undesired properties. So that, I think, is a big lesson. Another lesson, again pertinent to preventing and minimizing the cost of crises, is that these systems have tipping points, okay, where nonlinearities kick in and really sort of big changes start to occur. As I put it here, asymmetry and stock accumulation matters. So I just use this by way of example, one big asymmetry in the real world that you don't see in models is bankruptcy. Okay? One example that you don't see in many of the models is stock accumulation matters. And so you put the two of them together. stock accumulation matters. Too much stock, too high debt service, people can go bankrupt. You can see the potential here for recognizing the buildup of circumstances might well cause crises. The last point, independence is important, but it's not everything. Independence is important. You want to keep the politicians from having an influence on the short run setting of policy rates. That is clear. But when you think about the implications of monetary policy and how widely those implications are spread around the entire economy, it is important that the monetary authority cooperate, if not necessarily coordinate, but certainly cooperate with the regulatory authorities and the fiscal authorities. So, for example, looking back on the period after the great financial crisis, are we really happy with the outcome that we had a regulatory policy that was tightening, that we had fiscal policy that was tightening, and that monetary policy was left as the only game in town? Are we sure we're really happy with that as an outcome? So, lessons to help prevent and minimize crises. But being realistic, and I think that's what adopting the assumption it's a complex adaptive system is all about. It's about being realistic. With the best will in the world, we're not going to avoid all crises. Okay, we can take all the steps that we want. It'll minimize, but it won't avoid crises. So what we also need is we need lessons about how to monitor signs of systemic risk. Because the first bullet, expect the unexpected, because complex adaptive systems are by definition adaptive, policymakers are very prone to fight the last war. So we think, for example, about the framework for monetary policy coming out of the great financial crisis, okay, which basically said the real problem we have to fight is disinflationary forces. And we have to pull out all the steps, and we have to tolerate very, very low interest rates and ultra easy monetary policy in order to get inflation up. And then all of a sudden, we got more than we'd bargained for, okay? Because we were misled into thinking that what had been is what will be. So in these systems, item number one, expect the unexpected. Second, focus on systemic risks rather than triggers. In a systemically stressed system, anything can be the trigger. It can be something that seems totally unimportant, but it can be something that, given the stress that the system is already under, like pricking a balloon with a needle, okay, all of a sudden everything goes wrong and the cause seems to be basically nothing. So focus on systemic risks rather than where the next trigger is likely to be. And what I mean by that is you should be looking at things like growing levels of debt, leverage, growing interconnectedness, globalization, codependency, liquidity issues, market functioning, all of those kinds of things that can tell you that the system is under stress and that things could go seriously wrong. A very similar kind of lesson, be guided by multiple indicators. In complex adaptive systems, things can go wrong in many, many different ways. And the stresses that you should be monitoring are multiple. Or to turn the whole thing around, to say, as we currently would say, that if inflation is under control, then everything is under control, is just simply wrong. Next point. Forecasting in complex adaptive systems is essentially impossible. And what that means, in addition to saying we should be more humble about our forecasts, is that it might be desirable, indeed, I think it is desirable, to have alternative scenarios. So you start to think through the way the risks are building up, and you start to tell a story. You try to make up stories, essentially, of things that are plausible outcomes in a complex system. And then what you put forward to the public is essentially the alternative plausible narratives. And of course, one of the advantages of doing it that way is you do remind people, okay, the actors in the system, you do remind them that what we're facing in a complex adaptive system is not risk that you can measure and quantify. It's uncertainty, basically implying we simply do not know. And that might in turn induce them to behave in a more prudent fashion that they have been behaving in the current system. And lastly, and this is a minor point, a lot of people that are involved in complexity and complexity economics say rely more on data than on theory, but question both. So I guess what that comes down to is probably more of a reliance on VAR-type models and on the kind of structural or semi-structural models that are really the heart of what people mostly put forward. Well, we try as best we can to prevent crises. We monitor as best we can stresses building up in the system. But I would contend that crises will still occur, and that we should draw some lessons from this CAS framework about how you should manage them. So I guess the first one is pretty obvious. I mean, if you know these systems are going to break down according to a power law, be prepared. The Boy Scout motto: be prepared. And the preparations. Let me make this point. And if you think, well, that's so obvious, everybody's doing it. Think about Dodd-Frank. I mean, Dodd-Frank in the United States significantly reduced the powers of the Fed to manage crises. And the logic on which that was based was the other elements of Dodd-Crisis mean that crises can't happen, so therefore they don't need the powers to deal with them. Okay, so there is an issue out there. These things break down, they always break down according to a power law, and we have to be prepared. The preparations, I think, come in two forms. One of them is making preparations today that allow you to deal with future crises. And there, I guess, the ex-ante preparations. Have you evaluated your safety nets? Are they fit for purpose? And I'll say a few words about that in a moment. Have you played war games between the Ministry of Finance and the central bank about who's going to do what, under what circumstances? Have you got clear designation of responsibilities? So all of those things are insolvency procedures is another thing that I should mention. Have you ensured that your insolvency procedures are, whether they are court-based or administratively based, are they conducive to orderly bankruptcies or insolvencies, or rather are they of such a nature as to lead to sort of cascading effects where one person's bankruptcy leads to another? So ex ante, there's a lot of work to be done in preparing yourself for future crises. Another point to make is that we need adequate policy flexibility ex post. So it's not just you're preparing for future crises. You want to make sure that when the crisis happens, that policy can react flexibly. And I've already made reference to the Fed. I'm not so sure that's been happening in the States. And the real reason for it is in these complex adaptive systems, all the crises are different. So you can't say there's a standard crisis. I guess the line that's often used is, what is it? History doesn't history doesn't, it repeats itself. So there are differences, and you should have the flexibility to be able to deal with those differences. The last lesson, I guess, or next to last lesson, is use crises to improve resilience. This is what Nassim Taleb calls create anti-fragility, that you come out of a crisis stronger than you went in. And there's really two reasons why that might happen. One, you get a crisis, and it points out weaknesses in the system that were contributing to fragility. Well, now is the time. You didn't know about them before. You know about them now. Do something about it so it doesn't happen again. But the second thing, of course, is when you do have a crisis, this is this great line of Emmanuel, who was Obama's chief of staff, never waste a good crisis. When you've got a crisis mentality, it's often easier to do things politically than it would be to do if there wasn't a crisis. Okay? So those kinds of opportunities you should be looking out for, and you should use them. And the last point here about lessons to make manage crises when they do occur. Make those responsible pay a price. One of the difficulties that we have with the current system, and this is not the monetary policy so much, although it is in part, is that whenever we have crises sort of unfolding, the safety nets, and that includes increasingly ultra easy monetary policy, but also the other safety nets like lender of last resort, support by the central bank for market functioning, et cetera, those safety nets tend to widen. And in a sense, you can see that if that's the case, and those who have, in a sense, been responsible for causing the crisis through imprudent policies, they get off scot-free, then they're going to continue their bad behavior in the future. So it's very important that they do make people pay a price. Well, very briefly now, let me just run through how likely is it that any of the lessons that I've just been drawing are going to be reflected in changes going forward. I have actually gone back and looked at some of the stuff being prepared for the framework reviews by the ECB and the Fed. They're both having big reviews in 2025. And the first point, I guess, I think is true is that the targets for price stability, the target is likely to be price stability going forward, as it has been in the past. That is unlikely to be changed. I doubt very much that there will be an increase in the target inflation rate. I doubt very much that there will be much more interest in avoiding financial problems induced by financial stability, that it will be more or less business as usual. And most of the documents that you see and talk about, basically they talk about moderate reforms to the system that's there already. One thing, though, I do think that will happen is that after the 2020 review, and I was sort of mentioning earlier, with the many years of having inflation below target and trying to get it back up, that they actually built a symmetry into the review. Sorry, into the 2020 review. So you think about the average inflation targeting in the U.S., and it was not very, very different in the case of the ECB, that they were really more worried about disinflation and deflation than they were worried about inflation. And in consequence, waited too long to lean against the inflationary pressures that were building up. I think that they will reverse that. And I think that's still more likely if an era of scarcity replaces the era of plenty. And I talked about this, I think, at great length next year, so I won't go into it. But I think we're heading for a world in which higher real rates, higher inflation, and higher real rates will be more common than they have been. I also think there's going to be more restrictions on the use of quantitative easing and forward guidance. Everybody's talking about sort of explain more clearly when you're going to use it, why you're going to use it. So I think we're going to see more of that, more restraints on that. But having said all that, I think there's a growing willingness on the part of central banks to lean against inflation going forward, inflationary pressures going forward, than in the recent past. Threats to central bank independence are also growing. And we can come back to this later, but this whole question in particular about fiscal dominance, that if you have a world in which higher interest rates increase debt service on the part of the government so much that people start to doubt their capacity to honor those debt service requirements, well, then there'll be a lot of pressure on the central banks to keep the rates low. And they'll find other ways to induce people to buy government bonds that will allow them to do so. So a number of people, I'll be very brief on this, a number of people outside the central banks have actually been looking into how do you improve the monetary policy framework. None of them have explicitly referred to the complex adaptive system that I would like them to refer to. Virtually all of them, however, come to the same conclusion that embracing complexity would lead you to, which we don't know as much as we think we do. And virtually all of these suggestions from these different sources all stress the need for more humility and prudence and less simplification. So the first one is the G30 report coming out of New York. You know, G30's been around for years and years. I had a report last year, basically just talked about the dangers of prolonged easy money, which a theme they've been playing really for a decade. The Geneva report was also published in 24, which is called Much Money, Little Capital, and Few Reforms. Stresses that easy money leads to financial instability and that the central bank should pay much more attention to that. Then we had the Bernanke report that was produced for the Bank of England about how they could produce their forecasting performance. There, I think he had three very useful things to say. He was very explicit. You needed much more detail about the financial transmission mechanism. You wanted to get back into that area that really could cause a lot of unintended consequences. Secondly, he called for alternative scenarios. I mentioned that before, to reflect the fact that there's a lot of uncertainty. And thirdly, he made, this is his fifth recommendation, and he raised the problem of, quote, deeper problems with the underlying forecast framework or unrecognized changes in the structure of the economy, end of quote. But he gave no suggestions as to what those underlying problems might be, which is what really I've been sort of banging on about. Okay, and then Elizabeth Schnabel and Charles Goodhart, who are both sort of well-known figures today, they're both of the view that alternative scenarios should be used, and they actually would get rid of the base case altogether for fear that it would encourage people to believe that we know more than we do and would encourage imprudent behavior. And then my last slide, which I'll be very brief about, is Claudio Borio and the BIS. Now, I was the economic advisor at the BIS for 15 years and basically started all of this stuff. And the BIS, I'm pleased to say, has been more or less faithful to the approach and what they've been saying. And Claudio Borio has a wonderful paper published by OMFIF here just a couple of months ago. It's up on the BIS website. And the BIS annual report, of course, was similar. We need to worry about the longer-term effects of monetary easing, about all this buildup of debt and the other kind of imbalances that they'll come back to haunt you. We need more attention to financial stability and supply-side shocks. You know, the models have been simplified to a point that they've taken out everything that's really of interest to a central banker. So we need to pay attention to that. Again, we need to fear inflation overshooting more than undershooting. And I mentioned that before. I think that's coming down the road, that the previous asymmetry will be gotten rid of. We need to build in buffers and restrain the use of extreme measures. So, you know, you need broadly higher capital requirements. You need more care in terms of using QE and extraordinary forward guidance, and just more generally. And of course, this goes back to my first couple of slides. We need to be much more skeptical of models that are based on DGSE type of modeling and R-square modeling. I can go into more detail on that, but these things can be really very misleading, and it would be more appropriate to build all of our formulations on the assumption that the economy is a complex adaptive system. And I've been after the BIS, but they haven't actually done it to make explicit what I think is implicit in the suggestions that they're making, that it's a complex adaptive system, and that we should start learning lessons from other disciplines that have been embracing this concept now for decades and decades. Sorry, that's it. Thank you, Jason, for your patience.
Thank you, Bill. We will now move on to the Q&A component of today's event, starting with a reminder to please direct any questions to all panelists on the chat. For our first question, when you look at the period after the great financial crisis, and especially the past 5 years, what's your perspective on how and when to use QE, QT, and forward guidance?
Well, the funny thing about QE, okay, is that it was first brought in for purposes of financial stability. You remember the initial expansion of the balance sheet, first by the ECB, then by the Fed, then by many others, was basically the markets were all seizing up, and we had to do really sort of important things in order to ensure that the markets were functioning and financial stability would prevail. And then, so that was in 2008, 2009. And then when they unveiled QE2.2, it was for a totally different purpose. It wasn't for financial stability, it was for price stability. And one of the things that I think has been reflected in some of the comments I made earlier is that many people, both within the central banks and outside the central bank, say that the next time you use QE, you should be very clear as to the rationale about why you're doing it, because it really matters. The second thing about QE is that I think there's much more appreciation now of some of the downsides. Well, some of the downsides of ultra easy monetary policy more generally. One of them is it's hard to exit. It's always easier to ease than it is to tighten. So it's very hard to exit. And you see this with SVB and, the last sort of mini crisis, that what it was caused by was trying to raise rates in a situation where banks and central banks already had bought large amounts of long maturity government bonds. So that when you started to raise rate and expectations of longer rates went up, the prices of the assets that you bought went way down. And all of a sudden, we have problems of financial stability staring us in the face because people were going bankrupt. It basically was the cause of the SVB thing. Closely related to that, of course, is the central banks started, because they'd done the QE, started to show massive losses on their balance sheets. Or if they didn't recognize them up front, they knew they were going to be running massive operating losses for years and years to come. In the Swiss case, it was, I think in 2023, it amounted to 18% of GNP. So these are not minor issues. And the fact that they did the QE and the size of the increase of the balance sheet, central bank balance sheets, was about the same as the increase in the stock of government debt for many countries, led many people to say fiscal dominance is already here, which is the kind of message you absolutely do not want to give.
Yes.
So there's going to be a lot more care going forward. And the same thing with forward guidance. I mean, what is perfectly clear, and everybody understands it, is that the only kind of forward guidance you can give is conditional forward guidance. And early on, people simply said, this is what we're going to do. So you can have clarity about that. But of course, then they couldn't do it because the circumstances changed and inflationary pressures came back. So all of that means it'll be used more carefully. The last thing about QE that really has only come up in the course of the last couple of years is that if you've got a balance sheet, a central bank balance sheet that's massive relative to what it used to be, you're now operating an ample reserve system as opposed to a scarce reserve system. So the system that you use to control short-term interest rates has to change. And the one that we've got now with ample reserves is, I think, according to most people that are really familiar with this stuff, really much less efficient than the one we used to have. And the reason why is that when we gave the banks all those extra reserves, they found ways of using them so that now the excess reserves have turned into required reserves, but in ways that we don't really understand. So that when we start to tighten up by taking out reserves, the rates move much more than we would have anticipated. So there's a whole host of these issues, unintended consequences, that people are now saying, whereas previously I think they didn't think about them adequately.
Thank you. Broad and very helpful reply. If you look at the external reviews of the Bank of Canada for its actions during the pandemic, the Bank of England's forecasting and communications, and the Reserve Bank of Australia's major external review, what lessons do you draw from these expert reports for monetary policy during extraordinary shocks and during more typical economic environments?
Well, I I looked at all three of those studies with some care, and the first point that I would point out, excuse me, is that the outside experts are all people with a long experience at some other central bank. Carolyn Wilkins was one for the RBA. Some other central bank, or people that have been busy in the model building world for many, many years. So these are all people from, as it were, the traditional way of doing it. So when you actually look at the recommendations that they make, well, they themselves sort of describe them as, we embrace flexible inflation targeting, but we have some modest suggestions for reform. And as you can tell from what I've been saying, I think we should be thinking about something more than moderate. But anyway, having said that, all three of these reviews do provide some useful sort of extra input along the lines that I've suggested would be suggested by Embracing Complexity. One of them is all three of those reviews emphasize the importance of uncertainty and the need to have alternative scenarios at the least, whether or not you continue to produce the base case. The Bank of England review and the Bank of Canada review. The Bank of Canada review, I'll tell you honestly, I thought was by far the best of the three. They made some very useful suggestions about how you can sort of build nonlinearities into the current models that we've got. I think there's a growing recognition that this nonlinearity problem has got to be faced right up front. Also, the suggestion that we shouldn't start off by assuming that price expectations or inflation expectations are well anchored. That what we should be doing is saying central banks, we have to model central banks' credibility and whether the conditions under which they can lose credibility. I think all of that stuff is very, very useful. And then too, again, this issue about sort of clarity, all of them suggesting you need more clarity about how policy decisions are made, particularly about the use of experimental policy instruments. Again, a number of them talking about you need to have more cooperation between the monetary and the fiscal authority without losing your instrument independence. So I think they were all useful, but I'd have to say there was nobody there thinking really outside the box.
Picking up on certain aspects of your prepared remarks and your initial couple of answers, Looking at not only the policy pivot to massive fiscal stimulus during COVID-19, but more recently, we've got large-scale increases in defense and infrastructure spending by Germany and a number of other G7 countries. What should be the stance, in your view, of monetary policy, given this much greater and ongoing role of fiscal policy in the macroeconomic policy mix?
Well, as I tried to emphasize last year, sort of saying that we've gone through an era of plenty, positive supply side shocks, globalization, demographics, climate not a problem, that going forward, life's going to get more complicated and it's going to be more difficult. We're moving to an era of scarcity, and that's just bound to be more inflationary and have higher real rates. And a lot of the extra expenditure that's going to have to take place is going to come from governments. I don't think there's any, I won't go into the details, but, demographics alone, health expenditures, deglobalization, climate, grids, all of this stuff is in the hands of the government. And so fiscal is going to be a problem, particularly against the backdrop of the very high debt levels that we've let accumulate in essentially all of the advanced market economies. So so there's going to be a problem of how do you get through dealing with a higher debt service and tightening monetary policy. So I think the first thing that central banks should do is to say to the fiscal authorities, and you could imagine this going on in the US and in the UK and Europe, perhaps even Canada, to say to the authorities that our capacity to tighten further is significantly limited because of this fiscal dominance and financial dominance I talked about before. And so if you're looking for us to bail you out, it may not be possible. We've gotten to that state of affairs. It may not be possible. And so governments should be encouraged by the central banks to do what only governments can do, which is to both increase the efficiency and cut expenditures and raise taxes in ways that reduce the deficit and reduce the necessity for central banks to raise interest rates. Now, that's a pretty tough call. That's what they should do. I fear what will happen, and this is only a purely personal sort of prognostication, that confronted with these kind of problems, that the difficulty of dealing with the deficit problem, you ask yourself, what are the alternatives if you've got a deficit and a debt problem? Say austerity. Well, austerity is like really, really hard. You can encourage real growth, faster potential growth, more tax revenues, etc. That's also extremely hard. Structural change, and against the backdrop of the headwinds of debt, which are encouraging slower growth, not faster growth. Then the third thing you can do is you can write the debts off. But no advanced country wants to do that. It used to be fairly common prior to World War II, but since then, that's not been the chosen outcome. Then the next one is inflation. But, to put pressure on the central banks to let inflation rise. But the difficulty there, of course, is that as soon as inflationary expectations start to rise, then the real rates of interest start to fall. And so it encourages more spending rather than less spending. So it makes the problem worse, not better. So one thing that a lot of people are concerned about is that governments will find ways in the fullness of time to try to keep interest rates down through forcing people through regulation and administrative controls to buy more government bonds. And that's something that was done after World War II, and it actually worked pretty well. Of course, it, how can I say, did no favors to the middle classes who bought the bonds, because the real rates of return were, I think -4% in the UK, -9% in France. But, you do that kind of thing and you can get rid of a debt overhang pretty quickly. So I think there will be an element of recourse to the least, what's the word, least difficult way out, but I certainly hope not. I think central banks will, as I said before, I think they will and they should resist the inflationary pressures through tightening monetary policy, and hoping that the system will stay together in spite of that kind of shock.
Thank you. For our last question, Bill, and it's particularly appropriate in the context of the U.S. administration's behavior, unique challenges with its policy reset, given the financial stability risks and inflation concerns. In brief, what would you recommend going forward for the Fed's guidance for markets, households, and firms?
I guess it would be the message that they're trying to give at the moment, which is that they are committed to fighting inflation, and they will do whatever is required in order to meet their objective. And that's the right thing to do. And we shall see whether it can be enabled, given the constraints that financial stability and fiscal sustainability put upon them. But I think to give any other kind of message would be not only wrong but imprudent. So that's what I hope they'll continue to do. Above all, we don't want a kind of wage price spiral that's going to complicate the very real problems that we're going to have going forward anyway, as I earlier described.
Yes.
So, hold the fort, but as I strongly suggested before, it's very important that in order to hold the whole system together, that steps are taken to try to deal with the problems of fiscal dominance and financial instability. And those are what's the word? Those are decisions and those are policy changes that are going to take place, and not within central banks, but elsewhere.
Yeah. Well said. Bill, thank you very much for the fulsome Q&A as well as your prepared remarks. And over to you, Nez.
Thanks very much, Bill and Jason. This was a very insightful conversation and lots of good dialogue and questions. I think if there's one takeaway for me, the takeaway headline is the economy, as we understand it, is not simple, it's not understandable, it's not controllable. And there are limitations to the tools available to Bank of Canada and other central banks around the world. For example, there's a limitation to the efficacy of quantitative easing. While it leads to lower interest rates, it creates other unintended consequences in the means of asset inflation and other, inequality issues and societal issues that we have experienced around the world in the last decade or so. Thank you very much again for your time. And that brings the macroeconomic policy webinar series in 2025 to its conclusion.